So we're going to do the muscles of the arm and the hand. So the first one we're going to do is the pectoralis major. So it's like up here. The origin is the sternal end of the clavicle, the sternum and the cartilage of ribs 1 through 6, and the insertion is the short tendon into the tubercular sulcus and greater tubercle of the humerus. And the action is it adducts and medially rotates the arm.
Next is the deltoid, which is right here. The origin is lateral third of the clavicle, spine of the scapula, and the insertion is the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus, and the action is arm abduction.
So then we have the latissimus dorsi. That is right here. So the origin is the lumbodorsal fascia into the spines of the lower 6 thoracic vertebrae, the lower 3 to 4 ribs, and the iliac crest. We're going to edit that part out. Okay, so latissimus dorsi is right here. So from here down, and it kind of wraps around. The origin is the lumbodorsal fascia into the spines of the lower 6 thoracic vertebrae, the lower 3 to 4 ribs, and the iliac crest. And the insertion is the around the teres major into the floor of the inner tubercle sulcus of the humerus. So it goes around, as you can see, to up here. And the action is the arm extension, the arm abduction, and the medially rotates the arm.
Next is the subscapularis, which is right here. The origin is the subscapular fossa of the scapula, and the insertion is the lateral tubercle of the humerus, and the action is rotates the arm medially.
Next is the supraspinatus. That's right here. The origin is the supraspinous fossa of the scapula, and the insertion is the superior part of the greater tubercle of the humerus. And the action is it initiates abduction of the arm.
Next is the infraspinatus, which is right here. The origin is the infraspinosus fossa of scapula, and the insertion is the greater tubercle of the humerus, posterior to the insertion of the supraspinatus, and the action is rotates the arm laterally.
Next is the teres minor. That is right here. The origin is the lateral border of the dorsal scapular surface, and the insertion is the greater tubercle of the humerus inferior to the infraspinatus insertion, and the action is it rotates the arm laterally.
Next is the teres major, which is right here. The origin is posterior surface of the scapula at the inferior angle, and the insertion is the crest of the lesser tubercle, insertion of the tendon fused with that of the latissimus dorsi, and the action is extends medially, rotates, and abducts the arm.
Okay, next is the coracobrachialis. That is right here. So if you move those, it's right here. The origin is the coracoid process of the scapula, and the insertion is the medial surface of the humerus shaft, and the action is it flexes and adducts the arm.
Next is the triceps brachia. The origin is the scapula and humerus, and the insertion is the ulna, and the action is the powerful forearm extensor. As you can see, it's right there.
Okay, next is the anconeus. The anconeus is So next is the, why did we go to that? Okay, next is the anconeus, and that is right here. The origin is the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and the insertion is the lateral aspect of the olecranon of ulna, and the action is elbow extension.
Next is the biceps brachii, which is right here, the 14 and the 15. The origin is the scapula, and the insertion is by common tendon into the radial tuberosity, and the action is flexes and supinates forearm.
Okay, next is the brachialis. So the brachialis is actually underneath the biceps brachii, so if you were to take it off, it's right here. The origin is the anterior surface of the distal humerus, and the insertion is the coronoid process of the ulna anacapsule of elbow joint, and the action is the forearm flexor. Brachialis 20.
So the brachioradialis is right here. The origin is the supracondylar ridge at the distal end of the humerus, and the insertion is base of the radial styloid process, and the action is flexing the forearm.
Next is the pronator teres. The pronator teres is right here. Its origin is the epicondyle of the humerus and the coronoid process of the ulna, and the insertion is the midshaft of the radius, and the action is it pronates the forearm.
Next is the flexor carpi radialis, which is right here, number 24. The origin is medial epicondyle of the humerus, and the insertion is base of the second and third metacarpals, and the action is powerful flexor of the hand.
Okay, so next is the palmaris longus. That's 25 right here. So as you can see, it runs down to your palm. The origin is the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and the insertion is the fascia of the palm, and the action is it tenses the skin and the fascia of the palm during hand movements.
Next is the flexor carpi ulnaris, I believe. It's number 26. The origin is the medial epicondyle of the humerus, olecranal and posterior surface of the ulna, and the insertion is the pisiform and hamate base of the metacarpal 5, and the action is flexor and abductor of hand.
Okay, next is the flexor digitorum superficialis. That is 27. The origin is the epicondyle of the humerus, the coronoid process of the ulna, and the insertion is the 4 tendons into the middle phalanges of the 2nd through the 5th finger. And its action is it flexes the hand in the middle phalanges of fingers 2 through 5.
So next is the flexor pollis longus, which is right here, number 29. Its origin is anterior radius, interrodius membrane, and the insertion is distal phalanx of thumb, and the action is flexes distal phalanx of thumb.
Next is the flexor digitorum profundus. That is 28, so underneath all these, right here. The origin is the coronoid process of the ulna. The insertion is the 4 tendons into the distal phalanges of fingers 2 through 5. And the action is it flexes the distal interphalangeal joints.
Next is the extensor carpi radialis longus, which is number 21, right here. The origin is lateral supracondyle ridge of humerus, and the insertion is the 2nd metacarpal. The action extends hand and abducts the hand.
Next one is the extensor carpi radialis brevis, which is 22. So you can see under 21. Its origin is the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and the insertion is the base of the third metacarpal, and the action is it extends and abducts the hand.
Next is the extensor digitorum, which is number 31, which is right here. Its origin is lateral epicondyle of humerus, and the insertion is 4 tendons into exterior expansion and distal phalanges of the 2nd through 5th finger, and the action is the prime mover of finger extension.
Next is the extensor carpi ulnaris, which is 33. So right here. The origin is the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and posterior ulna, and the insertion is the base of the 5th metacarpal, and the action is it extends the hand and adducts the hand.
Next is the supinator, which is number 35. Its origin is lateral epicondyle of humerus, proximal ulna, and its insertion is proximal end of radius. The action is it assists in biceps brachii to forcibly spinate the forearm.
Next is the abductor pollicis longus, which is 36. So you take off these. It's 36. The origin is the posterior surface of the radius and ulna, and the insertion is the base of the 1st metacarpal and trapezium, and the action is it abducts and extends the thumb.
Next is the extensor pollicis brevis and longus, which is 37 and 38, which is right here. Its origin is the dorsal shaft of radius and ulna, and the insertion is the base of the proximal and distal phalanx of thumb, and the action is it extends thumb.
Okay, so next is the extensor indicis. The origin is the posterior surface of the distal ulna. The insertion is the extensor expansion of the index finger, and the action is it extends the index finger. So as you can see in the book, so right here is the extensor indicis, and it points to here. It's underneath like the extensor digitorum and like all of those muscles.
Next is the abductor pollicis brevis, which is number 41 into the hand right here. Its origin is the flexor radiculum and nearby carpals, and the insertion is lateral base of thumbs, proximal phalanx, and the action abducts the thumb.
Next is the flexor pollicis brevis, which is 42. So under inferiorly of the 41. The origin is the flexor retinaculum and nearby carpals. The insertion is the lateral side of the base of the proximal phalanx of thumb, and the action is it flexes the thumb.
And the next one is the opinus pollicis, and its origin is flexor reticulum and trapezium, and the insertion is whole anterior side of metacarpal 1, and the action is opposition.
Okay, so as you can see right there, opponent's pollicis. Next is adductor pollicis, which is 43. So right here. Its origin is the capitate bases of the 2nd through the 4th metacarpal, and the insertion is the medial side of the base of the proximal phalanx of thumb, and the action is it adducts and helps oppose the thumb.
Next is the abductor digiti minimum, which is number 44 right here. The origin is the pisiform bone, and the insertion is the medial side of proximal phalanx of little finger, And the action is abducts the little finger.
Okay, next is the flexor digiti minimi brevis. The origin is hamate bone and flexor reticulum. The insertion is the medial side of proximal phalanx of little finger, and the action is it flexes the little finger. So as you can see in the book. So then is the opponent's digiti minimum, or minimi. Its origin is the hamate bone and flexor retinaculum. The insertion is the medial side of metacarpal 5, and its action is it adducts and helps to oppose the thumb.
Which is right there.
Next is the lumbricals. The origin is the lateral side of each tendon, and the insertion is the lateral edge of extensor expansion on proximal phalanx of fingers 2 through 5. And its action is it flexes the fingers at the metacarpophalangeal joints, but it extends the fingers at the interphalangeal joints.
So that's going to be like right in between here. It's going to be like the web part of the hand.
Next is the palmar interossi. The origin is the sides of the metacarpals facing the midline, they are missing though from metacarpal 3, and the insertion is the extensor expansion on the first phalanx of each finger. Its action is it adducts the fingers.
Right there.
And last is the dorsal interossi. The origin is the sides of the metacarpals, and the insertion is they are over the proximal phalanx of 2 through 5 on the side of the opposite metaxis of the hand, and it's actually on both sides of finger 3. And the action is it abducts the fingers.
Which is right there.
That was torture.